Since 1996, the EPA has been tracking and recording the top reasons for a vehicle to fail a state emissions test. Every single quarter of every year, the EPA releases that information to anybody who has any desire to know about it. So what we want to talk about now is a list of the current trouble codes that are found in 2018 fourth quarter and the possible solutions to repairing those problems. So the first one happens to be a P0420 code, stands for Bank 1 Catalyst Below Threshold. Most of the time, the solution to repairing that type of trouble code turns out to be a catalytic converter has actually failed and you got to replace it. This is all determined by whether or not there's an exhaust leak present, however. So honestly, the easiest and best way that I personally know of to determine if you actually have a failed catalytic converter or possibly it's sucking in some air through a Venturi effect via exhaust leak would be to use an emissions calculator. There's several emission calculators that you can find online that are free of charge. However, there's some that if you pay a small amount, say $20, $30, it takes it to the next level. So a lot of the emission calculators online will give you volumetric efficiency, but it won't give you anything else. There's some out there, like I said, though, that will take it to the next level. And one of them in particular will even go ahead and give us a catalytic converter efficiency calculator. What I like about using the calculators is we all know that there's 3 precious metals inside of a catalytic converter to allow it to work. Well, this calculator will tell us at what percentage each one of those precious metals are located inside the catalytic converter. So obviously if say platinum and palladium were in the 90% range, but rhodium happened to be, at 70%, you would expect to see that that vehicle is not only having a P0420 code, but is also polluting the air with a high level of NOx, since rhodium is the precious metal that's responsible for cleaning up that particular gas. This calculator also allows us to determine whether or not we have a Venturi-style exhaust leak. So this, even though we can't hear the exhaust leak, this will tell us if it's getting some false air being sucked into the exhaust stream from an outside source. So it really takes all the guesswork out of determining whether or not the catalytic converter is at fault or possibly you have an exhaust leak present. A side note, when discussing using a gas analyzer in general to help you to determine if there's a problem with the catalytic converter, is a lot of times people place a whole lot of emphasis on the 5 particular gases. You guys are well aware of those gases, the CO, the NOx readings, the HC readings, the CO2 readings, and the O2 readings. However, there's another type of scenario that we could use which makes it a little bit more advantageous for a diagnostician, and that's if you start to use the lambda reading. The lambda reading, if everything's going the way it's supposed to and you have a perfect stoichiometric fuel economy, you have a target reading of 1. And if we go ahead and we use lambda, the nice thing about that particular reading on a gas analyzer is it does not get changed by what's happening in the catalytic converter. So we can actually see, if we start to master the lambda reading, we can actually see if the engine was fueled correctly going into the combustion chamber as opposed to just reading the exhaust gases coming out of the tailpipe. The next most popular code is a P0171, which means bank 1 is too lean. The most common cause for this oftentimes is a vacuum leak. The vacuum leak could be an air boot leak, it could be an intake manifold gasket leak, it could be low fuel pressure, it could be any type of fuel volume type of problem. So basically the best way that I know to help determine whether or not you have a problem with a vacuum leak, to rule that out first, would be to use your smoke machine, as we said before. Go ahead and introduce smoke into like the power brake booster hose and look to see if you have a leak present anywhere. If it happens to be a fuel pump or a fuel volume related issue, your best tools to help diagnose that would be looking at the fuel trim on your scan tool. That will help give you a good insight as to whether or not it's fuel related or vacuum related condition that's causing this bank 1 2 lean type of trouble code. Another popular code is a P0455, which is a gross evap leak. The most common cause for this usually results in a faulty gas cap or a filler neck. If you're from the area that I live in, where it's pretty much the rust belt of the country, it's not uncommon for those filler necks to actually corrode away, causing a huge leak present. Now on this code, I would start by checking the actual trouble code itself with my scan tool, and I would look up the code setting strategy. There's so many different ways that the various manufacturers actually run for this type of test to determine to set this code in the first place. The best examples I could give you would be to do some real-world research and actually use some of the Mode 6 diagnostics. On the screen now, we have a typical code setting strategy and how this particular vehicle, this happens to be off of a Ford product, actually runs that test. This is a really good example of how you can actually use Mode 6 to help diagnose certain vehicle problems. So a lot of times you might just get a vague code, like say a P0440, which would just be an evaporative system leak, or in this case it happens to be a gross leak. It tells you exactly what the computer needed to see to test for that condition in order to set that particular code. So we're seeing from this description that we're actually unable to build any type of pressure change inside the gas tank while we're doing the evap monitor. So it would have to be some kind of huge leak, as if somebody left the gas cap off or there was a huge hole in the system. So what is in our minds when we're looking at some of this type of stuff with the Mode 6 code setting strategy? Well, we're trying to use a little bit of common sense in diagnosis. So for instance, if we knew we had a gross leak present, it would make no sense for us to be hooking up a smoke machine and expecting to see a small trickle of smoke coming out of, say, the O-ring around the fuel tank pressure sensor or something along those lines. We would have to be looking for something that's pretty obvious that's causing the leak. Something like a disconnected hose or a stuck open purge valve, something along those lines. So you can use your smoke machine if you don't see an external leak. You can use your smoke machine to help determine whether or not the purge solenoid happens to be stuck open. Another code is a P0442, which is a small evap leak. The most common issues for this could possibly still be a gas cap. It wouldn't be that the gas cap was left off. It would be that the gas cap itself has a small little leak to the atmosphere. Could also be a canister closed vent valve or an evap bypass hose. The best tool in your arsenal for diagnosing this code is your scan tool and a smoke machine. You could go ahead and perform a system seal test while you are introducing smoke to the system to help you locate that type of problem. A P0440 code basically is kind of a hair pulling code for us technicians. It basically means I have an evap malfunction. The most common issue for this, there's many possibilities, but the most common issue oftentimes turns out to be a purge related issue. Check for some other codes to help verify that it's going to be purge related, and also check for the Mode 6 like we showed you in a couple previous slides that gives you the exact code setting strategy. Helps give you that common sense diagnostic insight that we were referring to help you diagnose this type of code. Another popular code is a P0141, which is Bank 1 Sensor 2 oxygen sensor heater circuit malfunction. Most of the time this turns out to be a faulty O2 sensor. There are a couple exceptions out there that actually have fuses that control the heater circuit of either the pre-CAD or the post-CAD O2 sensors. So you might want to print out a wiring schematic just to make sure there's no fuse in the circuit. As long as there's no fuse in the circuit, like I said, most of the time you're going to be replacing that particular oxygen sensor. The quick tip on oxygen sensors are, you have the 4 wires. Since we've got a heater circuit related trouble code, you can simply go ahead and unplug the harness going to the O2 sensor, take your red and black leads from your digital multimeter, and you should have, with the key on, you should have 12 volts present coming out of the computer side of the harness. If you don't, and you take a look to make sure that there's no fuse in the circuit, then you're probably going to have a wiring harness or a PCM type of problem. Another common code is a P0128, which is a coolant thermostat's out of range. Pretty much the answer to that question is either you're low on coolant or you have a bad thermostat. So you can always check TSBs, but most of the time you're going to be replacing the thermostat on the vehicle. The next most popular code is a P0174, Bank 2 System Lean. The common issues, you're going to want to go ahead and check the freeze frame information from your scan tool. If Bank 1 fuel trim is high, suspect an intake boot leak or a mass airflow sensor related problem, low fuel pressure, low fuel volume, vacuum leak by the manifold. Those are going to be your insights as to where to look for this type of particular problem. Again, your smoke machine would be one of the coolest things that you could use in your diagnostic arsenal to help you diagnose that problem. So that brings us to the end of the top trouble codes. At this current state of time, fourth quarter of 2018, for the most part, they don't change a whole lot from one quarter to the next. So these top trouble codes are probably going to be around even into the 2019, maybe some of them will be still present in the 2020 model year vehicles. My name's John Forro. I hope you found this interesting.